Join me as I dive into 10 Bible verses that everyone knows but hardly anyone understands, and see if I can make sense of them. Today we're going to tackle a really important topic that I think a lot of people can relate to. We've all heard these super familiar Bible verses that everyone knows and loves, but if we're being honest, many of us don't really understand what they mean. And that's what I want to dive into today, 10 Bible verses that everyone knows, but hardly anyone understands. One of the biggest challenges we face when it comes to interpreting these verses correctly is our own biases and assumptions. We often bring our own experiences and perspectives to the text, without considering the historical and cultural context in which it was written, and that can lead to some pretty significant misunderstandings. Another challenge is that we tend to focus on individual verses in isolation, rather than looking at the bigger picture and understanding how they fit into the overall narrative. And finally, we often overlook the nuances of language and translation, which can completely flip the meaning of a verse on its head. I think we've all been there. We read a familiar verse and we think we know what it means, but then someone comes along and points out something that completely changes our understanding of it. It can be pretty disorienting, and it's easy to get defensive or even feel like we've been misled. But I think it's really important to approach these verses with humility and an open mind, recognizing that our understanding is always incomplete and that there's always more to learn. The consequences of misunderstanding these verses can be pretty significant. If we're not careful, we can end up misapplying them in our lives, or even using them to justify harmful or oppressive behaviors. And that's not just a personal problem. It can have serious consequences for our relationships, our communities, and even our society as a whole. Okay, so let's dive into these 10 Bible verses that everyone knows, but hardly anyone understands. The first one is Philippians 4 verse 13, which says, "I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me." This is a super popular verse, and it's often used to motivate people to push through challenges or overcome obstacles. But did you know that the context of this verse is actually Paul writing from prison and saying that he's learned to be content in whatever situation he's in, whether he's in prison or out? It's not about mustering up the strength to do something impossible. It's about finding contentment and peace in the midst of difficulty. The second verse is Jeremiah 29:11, which says, "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future." This verse is often used to encourage people to trust in God's sovereignty and goodness, but the context of this verse is actually a letter to the Israelites who are in exile, and God is promising to restore them to their homeland. It's not a blanket promise that God will prosper us individually, but rather a promise of redemption and restoration for God's people. The third verse is Matthew chapter 7 verse 1, which says, "Do not judge, or you too will be judged." This verse is often used to tell people not to be judgmental or critical, but the context of this verse is actually Jesus teaching about hypocrisy and the importance of looking at our own lives before we try to correct others. It's not about never making judgments, but about recognizing our own flaws and biases before we try to judge others. The fourth verse is Romans chapter 8, verse 28, which says, "And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose." This verse is often used to comfort people in difficult times, but the context of this verse is actually Paul writing about the sovereignty of God and the redemption of all creation. It's not just a promise that God will make good things happen to us individually, but rather that God is working to redeem all of creation and bring it back to himself. The fifth verse is Proverbs 22 verse 6. "Train up a child in the way he should go. Even when he is old, he will not depart from it." This verse is often interpreted as a guarantee that good parenting will always result in godly children. However, it's more of a general principle rather than an absolute promise. It emphasizes the importance of guiding children, but it doesn't account for individual choices and circumstances. The sixth verse is 1 Corinthians 10, verse 13. No temptation has overtaken you except what is common to mankind. And God is faithful. He will not let you be tempted beyond what you can bear. But when you are tempted, He will also provide a way out so that you can endure it. Many people think this verse means God won't give us more than we can handle. In reality, it's about temptation specifically, not all life's challenges. It assures us that God provides strength and a way to resist temptation. The 7th verse is Matthew 18, verse 20. For where 2 or 3 gather in my name, there am I with them. This verse is often quoted to emphasize the power of small group prayer. While it's true that God is present when believers gather, the context of this verse is actually about church discipline and resolving conflicts within the community. The 8th verse is Psalm 37, verse 4. Take delight in the Lord, and He will give you the desires of your heart. This verse is frequently misunderstood as a promise that God will fulfill all our personal desires. However, the true meaning is that when we delight in the Lord, our desires align with His will, and He grants those desires that are in accordance with His purpose. The 9th verse is 1 Timothy 6:10. For the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil. This verse is often misquoted as, money is the root of all evil. The correct interpretation is that it's the love of money, not money itself, that leads to various forms of evil. It's a warning against greed and placing material wealth above spiritual values. And the 10th verse is Revelation 3, verse 20. Here I am, I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I will come in and eat with that person, and they with me. This verse is commonly used in evangelism to invite individuals to accept Christ. However, the context is Jesus addressing the church in Laodicea, urging them to repent and renew their relationship with Him. As we delve into these verses, I hope you're starting to see some common themes emerging. One of the biggest takeaways for me is the importance of understanding the context and nuance of each verse, rather than just taking it at face value. When we do that, we start to see that these verses are not just individual nuggets of wisdom, but rather part of a bigger story about God's redemption and restoration of all creation. Another insight that's really stood out to me is the importance of humility and open-mindedness as we approach these verses. We have to be willing to challenge our own assumptions and biases, and be open to new understandings and perspectives. And finally, I think it's really important to recognize that these verses are not just about individual application, but about the bigger story of God's redemption and restoration. In conclusion, today we've looked at 10 Bible verses that everyone knows, but hardly anyone understands. We've seen how misunderstandings can arise from our own biases and assumptions, and how these misunderstandings can have significant consequences. But by approaching these verses with humility and open-mindedness, and by understanding the context and nuance of each verse, we can gain a deeper understanding of God's redemption and restoration of all creation. Thanks so much for joining me today. If you have any thoughts or insights about these verses, please share them in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe for more content like this, and check out our next video on biblical teachings.